Now, that's the end of the history lesson. Why did we go through all this? Part of it is because we have to understand the context before we get into the books themselves, and that's where we're going to be going from here, is the books. Who is Tolkien, who is Lewis? We're going to look at a little bit at their biographies, but we're going to be diving directly into the fiction, into the themes. But before we go there, I want to talk a bit about G.K. Chesterton in this book, Orthodoxy. Because the orthodoxy component of this course, of the reading, is, as I've said before, it's the missing link. It's the move that actually gives, I'll put it this way, Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton is the philosophy of the fiction that Lewis and Tolkien write, which is why I had to assign it, because what Chesterton does in a very winsome, readable, witty kind of way is he says, let me tell you why the imagination and the Christian worldview is better than the one that you have concocted in this modern world. And it's an apologetics work. And here's the deal. I've handed that book to some non-Christians, and had a really interesting positive response. It's one of those kinds of books you have to use wisdom. You have to know when to give it to certain people. But the way he writes and the way he describes the rationalism of our world actually has broken people out sometimes of that syndrome. And what Chesterton goes through, and I'm going to focus on really two elements of it. He focuses first on the diagnosis of this modern world, and then he talks about the imagination as the cure for it. Now, the diagnosis that Chesterton gives, I think, is phenomenally important. His analogy that he uses of someone who has sort of pinned themselves in with this rationalism is he calls them a lunatic. And it's actually a brilliant analysis, because what he says is, the problem with the rational world right now is it's just believe in yourself. And we've all heard this, of course, repeatedly, even down until today. He says, believe in yourself, believe in yourself. And then Chesterton says, if you want to find someone who believes in himself the most, go to the lunatic asylum. He says, because the lunatic has nothing but himself that he believes in. He has wrapped his mind up into some madness where only what he has told himself is believable. And I think, again, he's being a bit coy here. He's being humorous. But what he says is, if you go to a madman who thinks that everyone out there in the world is out to get him, they have some sort of psychological problem, leaving aside chemical problems or mental defects, physical problems, that someone has sort of mentally, logically gotten themselves crazy. What Chesterton says is, if someone says, let's say I believe everyone in this room is out to get me, what Chesterton says is, the problem with that lunatic is he believes himself to such an extent that even if the entire room says, no, we're not, well, I, being the lunatic, will say, well, that's just what you would say if you're all out to get me. There's absolutely no, in other words, every bit of data you give me, I just push through my grid, because I have convinced myself of what is true, and I have built up my own individualism. And he just crushes this. And the way he plays, again, it's funny. But he says, this belief that you are superior simply because you're individualistic means that you're essentially in this lunatic asylum. And he says the great deal about Christianity is it doesn't ask you to be all on your own. In fact, it says that to be all on your own is what we traditionally used to call heresy. The heretic wants to be on his own. The Christian wants to understand what the faith of the saints and the apostles that was handed down was. And Chesterton talks about, for example, how the Christians have voted with their gravestones. The things they died for are the things we care about. That because we are part of one church, not just temporally now, but throughout time and space, that we actually care what our forefathers and foremothers did and believed and died for. What the world was, what the church was. And so Chesterton is going to, if you haven't read it yet, if you're getting a little sour on the fiction, if that's not ringing your bell, go to Chesterton. It will, and then go back to the fiction later. But Chesterton will give you again the philosophy behind the fiction, because so in other words, the diagnosis Chesterton gives is that the Enlightenment world is not expanding; it's diminishing. Lewis, I think, takes that full stop from Chesterton. So that's the diagnosis. What's the cure? Well, there's one chapter in the book Orthodoxy called The Ethics of Elfland. And again, if you're a little curious why elves and dwarves matter in these fiction works, or why these magical worlds are somehow important, it's that chapter, I think, that'll sort of click it together for you. Because what he says is that the imagination is not the thing that kills knowledge or truth. Rather, it's the thing that floats it and carries it sometimes. And what he is exploring is the idea that we are fully created beings, that God gave us imaginative minds as well as rational minds. And so, in other words, imagination is not a flight of fancy. It's not taking us away from the real world. What Chesterton says is what our imaginations do is it shows us how much our pure rationalism is bogus. Because find someone who thinks they're purely rational, and you will also find this same person having imaginative flights of fancy. That they actually still have an imaginative, sort of colorful world around them. A later apologist in the 20th century, a theologian, used to say that the atheist is the child sitting on their father's lap, slapping him in the face. And what's ironic about that is that he says is that you couldn't even reach your father's face if you weren't already sitting in his lap. In other words, he says you couldn't attempt to be rational if you weren't already part of the image of God. You couldn't try to cut God out of the picture of everything if he hadn't already created you and giving you the rational mind to begin with. So in other words, Christianity is not anti-mind, anti-rational. We just believe, Chesterton says, that the mind ain't the only thing. That there's something else that we're built for. And so therefore the imagination is one of the things that Chesterton will defend. Now he goes on to say that we don't simply, as Christians, believe that the biblical stories are myths. Now this is an important bit, and I'm going to lecture a little bit more on this as we go through. But if you're reading through Lewis and Tolkien, and if you actually look up, in some ways I'd say don't do this, but if you go and Google Lewis heretic, or Lewis non-Christian, or Tolkien pagan, all this kind of stuff, you will find innumerable blogs where they sort of say that these guys are non-Christians, that they hate the Bible, that they're they're the Trojan horses that are trying to make us leave the faith. There's a lot of fear based on these guys. I'm not really sure where it comes from. In fact, recently on social media, I said something about preparing for this class. I was commenting on how I was studying for it, and I just got bombarded by somebody. I didn't respond too much. But he said that Lewis, he was talking about Lewis in particular, he said, Lewis doesn't believe in the cross, he hates Jesus, he doesn't believe in the Bible, and he thinks everything's a myth. That was the response I got. And I said, it's interesting. And I just said, okay, I can't argue in 144 characters, so I didn't do it. But that being said, what you end up seeing is you see this concept of myth being talked about. And I'm gonna delve into this a little bit more, but I need to bring it up now. What happens to this word is a good example of how Lewis and Tolkien's world is not our own. If I were to say that the Bible is a myth, you would probably write the president of Gordon-Conwell and say, can you please fire this guy? He just called the Bible a myth. And that is because the word myth has undergone a change over the 20th century and now into the 21st century. What used to be said about the word myth is that there was a type of literature that functioned as a myth. In other words, that their myth is a genre of literature. Now, in other words, what that means, again, I'll make this clear. This is the old concept, the old view of the word myth, is that there was things that functioned as a myth. What do I mean? Well, a myth in this concept, in the older concept, is something that has an understanding of, it's basically a worldview, you might say, in a story form. A myth, something that functions as a myth, I should say, has a worldview. It has an understanding of how all things were created. It has an understanding of what holds everything together. And it has an understanding of right and wrong and at times how the world will end. So in other words, something can function as a myth. You look at pagan sources. So if you go and look up some of the Viking Scandinavian myths and read through the Elder Edda and the Prose Edda and these kinds of things, the Poetic Edda, what you end up finding is that they are myths, but they function as a myth. They are the Viking attempt to sort of describe their world and their worldview as a whole. Why is there lightning? Well, Thor is up there, striking the lightning. How was the world created? Well, it was created through the tree Yggdrasil and all these kinds of levels of planets, and all of the Bifast, the big bridge that goes from Valhalla down into our world, and all of this stuff. In other words, these books function as myth. And in Lewis and Tolkien's day, there was a lot of discussion about the function of myth, right? A lot of discussion about how certain texts give us our worldview, you might say. And so what ends up happening, and this is true in particular of Lewis, but Lewis started, after he converted, he started to refer to the Bible, the biblical story, as true myth. Of course, this is where people usually lose their mind, because they hear in that something else, and I'll get into that in just a second. But what Lewis is saying here is he's using the old phraseology, this old idea that the Bible is something that gives us meaning entirely, the biblical story. It tells us how the world was created. It tells us what holds everything together. It tells us how to find truth. And it tells us how to find redemption and how all things will be wrapped up in the end in the kingdom of Christ. But what the interesting thing Lewis adds, though, is the word true. He's saying this biblical story functions as a myth for us. It gives us all of the worldview we need, but it's true. But notice how in 3 or 4 generations later, you read this and people go, what a heretic. This kind of a thing. The reason why is because as we've moved into the modern world, going the other way, myth has been sort of wrapped up with the idea of sociology. So mythological studies, or the study of different myth traditions, and there's all kinds of stuff on this I won't go into, but it becomes a way of sort of diagnosing sociologically all the different cultures. And there was one main guy that does this, but there's a couple of others. And they start chronicling all of the ancient pagan world, and they start chronicling the modern mythological world and all the different gods and goddesses and different mythological views out there in the world. By the end of the 20th century, the word myth meant fake, made up, completely fictional. All the words that if I say, well, that's just a myth, we almost mean urban legend, almost sort of entirely made up. So be careful with this right off the bat, because if you see stuff in Lewis in particular, or in Chesterton, where he talks about the Bible being a myth, they are going to this old, early 20th century function. This idea, in other words, they're actually saying something far more profound. The biblical story is true myth, means it is everything that we wrap our lives around, and it gives us the perspective on all of this, but it's true. It's not just a story. Now, the main reason why, I will say this, the main reason why particularly Lewis is going after this is because people, for example, like Bultmann. Bultmann was a New Testament scholar, and he gave this word to us in New Testament studies in which he talked about demythologizing the Bible. Demythologizing it. And Bultmann, very famously in one of his books, says, I cannot walk into a room and flip on a light switch and believe in a world that has angels and demons and heaven and hell. And he says, so therefore, the goal is to, as you read the Bible, you're supposed to say, well, okay, this is some mythological world way back then. What we need to do is demythologize it, which is just another way of saying update it and make it modern. And so this demythologizing movement is exactly what is, and Bultmann wasn't really what Lewis was necessarily thinking about, but when Lewis is going after this concept of myth, what he's doing is he's hammering on the modernism, the rationalism. He says, you guys think you have understood the world because you have this rationalistic system, but you have your own mythology there, guys. You have your own perspective that gives you meaning in the world. And Lewis will say Christianity is the only true myth. It functions like a myth, but it's true. It happened. Christ came, he died, all these things, etc. Well, a lot of this comes in Chesterton, and when you read orthodoxy, you're going to see this same kind of argument being played out. This idea that the biblical worldview is more coherent and more full, it has a thicker understanding of theology and philosophy and meaning than any of the rationalism that's out there. But one of my favorite bits is the opening story, the opening analogy that Chesterton uses, because Chesterton himself for a while was rationalistic and very much not a Christian. And what he talks about, he says he always wishes he wants to write a story, he never does, about a man who gets in a boat on English shores and goes off to discover a new world. And through a series of storms and winds, he ends up landing back in a different part of England. But he's unaware that he's landed back on England. And so he gets out and he puts a flag down and he says, "Alas, I've found it." But yet he has arrived back home at the very end. And for Chesterton, that is sort of both a story of his life as well as a story of where he thinks the world ought to go. That the rational model said, "I'm going to go discover a whole new planet," and then they eventually come back and they land in, as the title says, orthodoxy. And Chesterton says that's him. He landed, and he thought he was planting a flag on an entirely new civilization, but in fact he was in Durham or somewhere else on the English shore, and he realizes then and there that the attempt by some to explain away the Bible as myth, or to say that it only functioned as myth, ended up leaving people with this sense that actually they had nothing left. And so what Chesterton ends up saying is that we need to not fight rationalism with rationalism only. I think that's a key thing, particularly I think in our world. You cannot fight rationalism with rationalism. You can be rational with people. You don't have to be irrational. But what you can't say if someone comes up to you and they say, "Well, you know what, I've just used my mind and science and I come up with these conclusions. How can you believe in a world with heaven and hell and angels and demons?" You can't say, "Well, good, let's go to the science lab and I'll show you the angel particle or the demon particle." You can't actually observe these things. So in other words, if you try to bring rationalism against rationalism, very often you will find it very frustrating. But what Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton before them say is what you need to do is model true biblical faithfulness and true biblical holistic psychology. What do I mean? If we are God's image, then we have been created with minds, with hearts, with passions, and with imaginations. And therefore, if you get them to experience that full breadth of what it means to be a human, that you'll actually entice them out of their befuddled rationalism before you'll convince them to come out of it. Yeah.
Handle the transcendental argument?
No, because good question. Did they ever handle the transcendental argument or some of the other apologetical theories? No, those were not yet on the scene. I do think that they're anticipating some of them, in meaning that some of these arguments about worldview collision, this kind of stuff, very, very much I think is in their front view, but it's not in their back view yet. It hasn't yet taken on the full seriousness that it has now in apologetics. But what Lewis and Tolkien, and again, Chesterton in particular will say is if you entice them out of their rationalism, if you entice them out of their atheism, if you show a life that is thicker, that is more full, that you can actually do sometimes better than if you just sit there and argue with them only. Notice in the fiction works of Lewis and in Tolkien how much they focus on things like eating and drinking, laughter, sleeping, joy, life. Those aren't just prop pieces of a story that they're telling. They're little shafts of light, of joy, of God's creation that we all experience. A couple of weeks ago, I actually had an apologetical dinner with a guy who's becoming an acquaintance. It's it lasted 5 hours. It was a dinner that went beyond. And the guy, it was interesting for me because obviously I've been doing a lot of work for this class and a lot of this Chesterton stuff was rolling around in my head. And the guy kept wanting to do the old classic rationalism with me. He kept saying, well, look, what about science? What about this? What about that? And he just kept expecting me to say, well, actually, I have a formula here that will show you that God is true. X plus y to the squared equals God or something, and this kind of idea. And I just said, you have a very interesting faith. And he said, I don't have faith. I said, you absolutely have faith. And we started walking through this whole thing, and I said, and I kind of did Chesterton type stuff with him. I said, you have locked yourself into this concept that you can figure everything out. I said, and in an early part of the dinner, he talked to me about how much he loved his wife and how she was a Renaissance woman and all these kinds of things. And I said, can you rationalistically explain how you love your wife? I said, you love your kids. I said, when you go home and you hug them, are you going to tell me that you don't somehow experience something that is beyond this rationalistic system that you have? And we started to go through there, and I wouldn't fence with him on the logic side of it. But I basically just said, everything you experience day in and day out that gives you joy, you can't explain on the system that you're telling me is the only answer. And what you end up having then is a locked up mental rationalism, a sort of holding out all these things until it's personal for you. And then from there, I went into some stuff about, the Bible does talk about that God loves us in that way. That when you hug your wife at night and kiss her, that is actually a biblical concept of love. And that when you want, I actually told him a story. I said, and I'll tell you it now. I went on vacation a couple weeks ago, and my daughter, who's 5.5, bless her heart sometimes, because she is so passionate, but she doesn't understand other kids at times. She's about to start kindergarten. She'll get a rude awakening when she meets the politics of the playground. But what happened is we were at this pool place down at the beach, and we were out in the pool, and there was a kid who was a year older than her, and he was mean to her. And I was inside. My wife was out with him, and it's actually strange because. As I'm even telling the story now, I feel this the same emotion sort of welling up within me. But she comes in to the condo, just broken, just weeping, just cannot believe that this other kid was mad at her. And I was telling this atheist the story. I said, I want to tell you right now, I literally wanted to go outside and beat up a 6-year-old. I said, I was so to see your daughter. Weeping because someone, I said, I'm going to kill him. It's like, this kid's like this tall. And I said, obviously, I didn't say that to my daughter. I said, but let's be honest. Every parent feels that. They're like, I will kill that kid. And of course, it would be the same abuse, worse abuse. But I said, what is that instinct? What is it that makes me want to love and defend my precious daughter because someone has done this to her? I said, it is not rationalism. There is something else that is going on there. There is a defensive fathering instinct in me that is there only because my Father has put it in there, and because I'm the image of God, I have these same instincts as part of the created order. And so Chesterton that's my story, but Chesterton would, I would hope, find that what I'm saying here is that kind of thing. When you're dealing with someone who's locked themselves up, you don't go in with them and lock yourself in there and say, hey, let's get out. Come on. Wait, I'm in here now with you. Uh-oh. Rather, you stand outside and say, don't you want to come out? Don't you feel locked up in there? In other words, you try to entice them out. And it is for that reason, again, when you read Orthodoxy, I think this is going to come home to roost for you. Because what he's saying is you entice people out. You show them a fuller understanding of creation. You don't live down to their assumptions of what they think life ought to be like. And this is true in culture wars as well. I am not opposed to the ongoing fights that people have with the sexual revolution and other kinds of things, the redefinition of marriage. I understand that people want to fight those fights. But let's also have good marriages and good love lives and good, let's let the world see us enjoying life as well. Not for its own sake, but for the pleasure of the God who created it, for the worship and the glory of Him. One of the things that I sometimes point out to students, I actually like this, is that in Jewish tradition, it became very common over the centuries. I'm actually not sure if it's still this way, to pray after the meal. Is it still the case? Yeah. Pray after the meal, not before the meal. And the idea there is give thanks when you're full, not when you're hungry. Give thanks when you've enjoyed all these things, when you've tasted it. Don't give thanks when you're hungry and you're thinking, "Whew, I need to eat now. I'm getting a little hangry." This kind of concept. Give thanks afterwards. In other words, give thanks for the pleasure of the joy of the food that you've had and the fellowship that you've had. I think that is a fully biblical concept of creation in the way that we ought to entice the world out of their sort of stifling rationalism. And that is where Chesterton will go with it.